This is Michael Ostrolenk, and I'm talking to Bruce Fein, constitutional scholar and author of American Empire Before the Fall and Constitutional Peril, the life and death struggle for our Constitution and democracy. How you doing, Bruce?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for inviting me.
Certainly. Hopefully this is one of many conversations that we'll have on character and culture. I know both are important to you. And the way I describe the way you talk about some of these issues is that I say, looking back at our founding fathers and how cultured they were and the men of character they were, and then looking at the so-called political leaders of today and our present-day culture, that it's quite possible that we are devolving.
Regressing. Yes.
Regressing. Could you speak to where we've come from and where you see us going in terms of both character and culture?
Yes, the first emendation I would make to your opening remarks is we need to add women into this equation, the types of Abigail Adams, who were also instrumental in winning the Revolutionary War. Although it is still true at that time that when Abigail Adams appealed to her husband John Adams not to forget the women in the Constitution or otherwise, they seemed to have neglected that aspect of equality. But just to know that even our founding fathers had feet of clay in some respects. But we want to address this issue really in a Darwinian sense, that we've gone backwards in both culture and in character. The founding generation felt that virtue, wisdom, and magnanimity were the motivations of higher life forms. Those were what should be your philosophy of life. And not that they paid no attention to creature comforts, but money, fame, drivel, the idea of becoming gratified by dominating others was marginal or outside their domain of character. It wasn't as though that they were without sin, but they viewed these as being vices, not virtues. And the political culture at that time rewarded those who were learned, who were thoughtful, who were statesmen, who could lead and excite the better angels of our nature from those who were not so gifted at birth. And so when you look at that founding generations, it's not the people who are very wealthy who are at the top and most admired, even though John Hancock, the insurance man, he has his big name on the Declaration of Independence, but he didn't write it, and he wasn't the one who's most honored for that that immortal parchment, if you will. But those who were leaders were those who were the most educated, the most thoughtful. They weren't driven by egomania and ambition just to crave the limelight or homage. Indeed, George Washington epitomized that reticence, if you will, by resisting efforts to leave Mount Vernon to occupy the presidency twice, voted unanimously into the White House. He also was reluctant in presiding over the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He did that out of a sense of duty as well. And if you read the correspondence between those politicians, it was this correspondence that resonated with the idea that we needed to make democracy, representative government succeed, because if it didn't, it would be the death knell for that form of government for the ages. It was so revolutionary compared to all the other despotisms and autarchies that existed around the world. And if you look at the politicians today, it's almost an inversion of what was true in 1787 or the founding generation. The politicians typically have vast amounts of money. They're driven by a desire for fame, for creature comforts, to satisfy their egos. There's some sense of gratification that comes from seeking to dominate domestically, internationally, the world around them through subsidies, government programs, fighting monsters abroad in trying to make the world in our own image. And these are not people who are thoughtful and philosophical people. It's not necessarily that they have low IQs, but they have not devoted their lives to thinking about values, to thinking about character. It's all driven by just money, fame, sex, domination. That's the four great cardinal vices. Wisdom, virtue, magnanimity, they're not even in the vocabulary. And that, I think, is demonstrated by looking at our political landscape and seeing how low these persons are held in the esteem of the American people.
In terms of character, you mentioned virtue as an example. Now, I know it wasn't just in the 18th century where these virtues were upheld, or at least held as ideals to reach towards. And I know your knowledge goes back much further. Can you speak to how our founding fathers actually looked backwards in time and to where they looked to find the kind of values that they wanted not only to live out themselves, but encourage us as American citizens to also live out of?
Well, they were humanists. They certainly derived an enormous amount of philosophical insight from the Greeks, to a lesser extent the Romans who built on the Greeks, so that they were masters of Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, those who also were in the Renaissance too, in terms of the idea that the individual was the center of the universe rather than big government. And that's why you find that in the Renaissance, the first time you find portrait painting everywhere. The individual is there. If you went to the East at that time, the individual was always faded into the background. And an understanding also that secular rule was the only way you could maintain a polity that wasn't convulsed by religious divisions. But that's what so it wasn't as though the Founding Fathers were necessarily inventing these ideas for the first time, but they were putting them into a political equation that was quite revolutionary. But in my judgment, they were relying upon, by and large, the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, including Epicurus, the Stoics, and Seneca, and Pericles, and Thucydides. They were fully versed in that understanding of the importance of combining both physical and mental discipline and restraining our appetites rather than gratifying them, the way they would call the Apollonian rather than Dionysian element of our nature. And they clearly were not attracted simply to money for the sake of making money, power for the sake of power. And I say that what's made that generation so unique in the annals, not only of the United States, but in the world.
You mentioned physical and mental discipline, and it strikes me when you said that the political culture our founding fathers were trying to create, looking back at the ancient Greeks as models, at least philosophically, was the human being as the center of the political universe. It seems perhaps that in our culture today, we've taken the idea of the individual as the center of the universe so far beyond what I imagine our founding fathers and the ancient Greeks would have thought of, because it's almost narcissistic. It's as if every individual believes only they are the center of the universe, as opposed to recognizing that every other person is also the center of the universe. Can you talk about the lack of physical and mental discipline, and perhaps the narcissism that affects our society today?
Yes, the idea of discipline is almost lacking in the United States. We almost celebrate those who are the most debauched, who give full vent to their vices, to the craving for money, more power. The more absurd they act and the more bullying they are. I mean, Donald Trump, I don't want to single him out as the worst, would be a characteristic. I mean, he would probably have been deported, by the Founding Fathers as a disgrace to everything that we were trying to cultivate in the United States. And instead of the individuals or children being raised, say, if you count something hard, you just got to crack down, and not all learning is pleasant, but you got to stick to it. So, well, all right, we try to make up ways to make it easier. Or we'll do it we'll put it in cartoons in the internet, and then we'll put it on your cell phone. Trying to cultivate or coax them. Well, please, if we try to give you candy and cake and anything, will you do what you ought to do? I mean, I went and would go through storms, snowstorms, rainstorms to go to the library to check out books, That was a great gratification. It was an opportunity. And we teach this kind of sense that, no, there are no standards that internally that you ought to hold yourself to, that if it's too hard, well, just give up and we'll give you a trophy anyway. It's like the idea of playing on a baseball team and everybody gets an award, picked up the trash the best, had the best smile or whatever. Instead of, you don't have to taunt someone it's not talent, but say you need to actually work very difficult. So like the old days, Thomas Edison said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. That's just, you got to do hard work. You got to bolster up. And so when we, with regard to physical indiscipline, people are obese, then we try to give them medicines or surgery or whatever, and said, hey, it's a very simple equation. You'll lose weight if you take in fewer calories than you expend. And it's a simple equation. It doesn't ever change. But all these excuses are made. No, advertisers make us do it. It's not really our fault. It's trying to blame anyone else. Now, I'm not saying that isn't an element of human nature, but the reason why we're given character and morals is to say, I'm not going down that road. I know that's not true. I can't be proud of not being able to restrain appetites. It's natural to have them because we're human. But the earmark of an adult society is to resist them, to suppress them, say, I'm not going to go there. And that is where what you grow up today is trying to indulge the appetites rather than trying to say, no, discipline really is its own reward. It's what it says about us. And that's both also with regard to intellectual, mental development. Well, it takes too long to read War and Peace or Les Miserables. It's 1,000 pages. How about a 5-page excerpt? And instead of reading the book of The Last of the Mohegans, well, let's just watch the movie, right? Anything that makes it easier. And they say it's a false promise, because unless you struggle, unless you undertake something that challenges your discipline and your resolve, you'll never, ever develop those virtues and have a confidence that you do have character. You got to test it. It's like anything else. If it's not challenged, it atrophies. And it's what you might call a paradox in life. No one wishes upon themselves enormous stresses, how you deal with perfidy or treachery or great misfortune. Yeah, you'd be viewed as a sadist if you urged it. But in some sense, that's the only way you're able to toughen yourself in a positive sense, to know that you are able to withstand that unfairness, what Shakespeare called the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And that gives you the kind of self-esteem that enables you to go through the peaks and valleys of life. But to say we are a very, very indulgent nation at present. And you can see it just in the general statistics with regard to obesity. Now even the military is worried, are we actually going to be able to recruit people who can satisfy the physical standards? The armed forces, it's a little tiny select group. We don't really have a citizen army anymore. And it's a general deterioration in health. And in some ways, that's reflected in the fact that as we keep spending more and more on health care, the incidence of illness continues to rise. Because most of it is just internal. Not all. I mean, it's silly to suggest no one doesn't have, through genetics or otherwise, something that they couldn't prevent, no matter how disciplined their mental and physical life was. But that's a smaller, tiny fraction of our total expenses. And then if you want to go about with regard to the values, what was so unique about the Founding Fathers is that basically understood that the real measure of civilization is not the unemployment rate or how many jewels they've got or balance of trade. It was the character and the idea that self-government, that the idea that each individual under the law was equal, were the true test of measuring civilization compared with what came before and what might come in the future. It wasn't an infatuation with a quantitative measure and, okay, this unemployment rate is X and this is the per capita income and we can go this fast and, hey, the internet makes us able to retrieve things even faster and if subatomic particles going faster than the speed of light. Those things are interesting, but it isn't really the foundation of civilization, which is based upon process, how we treat each other and how we try to discipline ourselves to maintain that dignity and self-esteem. And when they used the words in the Declaration of Independence, and not just Thomas Jefferson who wrote them, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are those what we're born with as unalienable rights. Pursuit of happiness meant pursuit of wisdom and virtue. It wasn't hedonistic. Pursuit of happiness, say, do LSD and satisfy all of your whatever sensual appetites, and that's what life is about. No, it's not that they were necessarily insistent on passing laws that said, okay, we're going to sentence you to prison unless you're the most frugal Puritan. But that was just built into the culture that attempted to encourage that kind of behavior and say would mark itself as a civilization. Say they understood that the march of the United States, as John Quincy Adams put it, was the march of wisdom. The first time in history, the march of wisdom was a country, not the march of domination, conquest, veni, vidi, vici, and hey, we're rich, everybody's got 5 houses and 7 cars and can indulge themselves. That wasn't what they're about. And unfortunately, I think that is basically what our culture has descended to, if you will. Like, it's clearly a regression, if you want to put it on the scale of civilization.
When we come together next time, I'd like to discuss with you at what times in our history do you think we switched from being in pursuit of wisdom and virtue to in pursuit of more base interests. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Michael.